Hello, my name is Joseph Cook. Welcome to part 2 of my series, Freedom Through Travel. This series is about my travels throughout the world. Part 2 is the former USSR. Today we look at Russia and also Estonia, which I spent a couple days in. I'll remember my trips to Russia and the people I met through my train rides. The first ride I really remember is a subway trip. The subway is kind of interesting because they used to double as bomb shelters. So sometimes you have to go hundreds of meters down to actually get to the subway. And the system is really good. I never waited more than 5 minutes for a subway train. But the train ride I remember is I was sitting down at the subway train, in the train, and I looked over to a girl about 5 years old who was with someone that I assumed was her grandmother. And she was kind of looking out the window, smiling and waving at someone I assumed was her mother. And she had a big smile on her face. And soon the train kind of took off, and she was still waving at her mother, but then she couldn't see her mother anymore, and she started getting upset. And it looked like she was about to cry. Her facial motions changed. And then her grandmother slapped her on the knee and said something to her, and immediately she became emotionless and became very stoic. This is something I noticed a lot when I visited Russia. The Russian people are very stoic. Even pictures, wedding pictures where you would smile, they didn't smile. But that shouldn't be confused as being mean or anything like that. I found the people to be very nice. Another experience I had on a train was a suburban train. This is a very crowded train from St. Petersburg out to Catherine's Palace. And the ride out was very crowded. On the way back, it was a little bit better. And I was sitting next to an Irishman, Paul, that I befriended from the hostel I was staying at. And we sat next to a very attractive young Russian woman and an older woman with these big glasses, and kind of had a really kind of weird look on her face, a weird smile on her face, and she kept staring out the window. And we became so used of knowing and understanding English that we became fairly liberal with what we said in Russia, just because there was very few people that spoke English. And we started talking, Paul and I, and we were talking about the attractive woman. Paul kind of told a dirty joke, and I was about to pull a dirty joke out of my dirty joke Rolodex when the older woman kind of looked at us and said, "So where are you guys from?" My head immediately went into my hands, but Paul didn't miss a beat, and he was saying, "I'm from Ireland, Joel here's from America." And we started talking a little bit, and she started apologizing, saying, "I don't speak very well. I don't speak very good English." And she mispronounced one word. She said something like stomach instead of stomach, something really minor. And she talked about her life in St. Petersburg. She actually had a couple gardens outside, and she went back and forth and sold her produce at the market in St. Petersburg. And I said, like I said, extremely nice. She even stopped when the attractive woman got off the train. She even stopped and let us kind of gawk at the woman as she left. And we talked for about half an hour, like I said, and it was really sweet. After her stop was before us, so she got off before us, and we kind of waved out the window, and she blew kisses at us. And that's something that I remember. The people there were extremely nice. It's just the language barrier was huge. I couldn't even read anything because it's in Cyrillic, so it was difficult.
Say something to America. Say something to...
I wish.
What?
I wish that our countries will be friends always. Okay?
Very nice. Is that it?
I stopped at Red Square and actually went to the area east of the Red Square. This was appeared in 1534 with a fortified wall of white stone. It was taken down in 1930s. It was originally kind of a merchant place, and now it's more of a place where there's banks and shops. What I saw in that area was some churches and some historical buildings like the Romanov Palace Chambers and a hotel, old communist-style hotel that housed 6,000 people. I then moved north of that area to a memorial called the Plevna Memorial, which is a memorial for the Russian-Turkish War of 1878. I then went north and west, past the old KGB building, to the Bolshoi Theater. This is the most famous theater in Moscow. It was built in 1825, has been going through a lot of restoration lately, and is the second biggest theater in Europe. I then went back to the Red Square area. The east side of the Red Square is dominated by the GUM. This was built in 1889 through 1893 and has a lot of department stores and restaurants in it, but it's huge. It takes up the whole eastern area of the Red Square. I then went to the Lenin Mausoleum. This was obviously built in 1924 after the death of Lenin. The first one was a wooden mausoleum actually until 1930. This was a bit odd to look at. He's been dead now since 1924, so it's been over 75 years. And the Russians swear that this is the original Lenin, that he's been embalmed. Others would say that this is a wax replicant. And I did look at parts of his hands, like his hands looked a little bit waxy. But he's in a black suit with the spotlight down on him, and you kind of just walk past him and you don't say anything. The soldiers make sure that you don't talk inside. And this is something that I had noticed in communist states or ex-communist states, that they embalm their leaders and put them in a mausoleum. Happened in Lenin in Moscow, in Beijing with Mao Zedong, even though he didn't look very good. And Ho Chi Minh in Hanoi also has this, but I was there in October and November, and that's unfortunately when he's getting his face redone. He's getting some cosmetic work, so I wasn't able to see him. So I think when Castro dies, or if Castro ever dies, the same thing will probably happen to him. He'll probably be in a mausoleum. This is kind of a tip for people here, a freedom tip, I guess. Once in a while I give tips on ways to free yourself without actually having to travel. And the way we can do it is by visiting the dead. This might seem odd, but I enjoy actually going through cemeteries. And when people say that, they think it's kind of crazy, but the truth is we're all going to end up in a cemetery eventually. We're all going to die eventually. And this is a good experience for me because it tells me that I'm going to die someday, that I'm not immortal. And some of the people I see on those headstones, they lived a shorter life than me, so it's kind of inspirational for me to really live life hard and live as, you know, do as much as I can in the time that I'm here. Talking about the Red Square is probably famous because of its May Day celebrations back in communist times. It was originally built in the late 15th century as a square where you could purchase food and livestock. In the 16th century, it was renamed Trinity Square, and then in 1650, it was renamed Red Square. There's 500,000 square feet in the Red Square. One of the main buildings to visit in the Red Square is the Kremlin. This was built in the late 12th century. It was originally a fortress. And the main thing to see in the Kremlin is the Armory Museum. This is 9 halls, and all the different halls have different items in it, such things as goldsmith, Fabergé eggs, Oriental items. There's Western European armor, including the armor of Peter the Great, which is really impressive because he was 6'7", which was huge for that day. Also some crowns, such as Ivan the Terrible's crowns, the royal carriages, which is also impressive. And in the area outside the armory, there's also the Tsar Bell, Annunciation Cathedral, and Cathedral of the Archangel. Just outside the Kremlin area is a flame that's dedicated to the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. This particular soldier died in 1941. It helped, he was one of the soldiers in one of the battles that helped turn the tide versus the Germans. And there's also 6 urns in this area. These 6 urns have some dirt in it, and this dirt's from 6 different cities. All these cities played an important role. Battles in these cities played an important role in World War II in turning the tide versus the Germans. It's now a place where people often go on their wedding day to take a picture in front of. The next place I visited was Gorky Park. This is outside the Kremlin area. This was first created in 1928, and it has 275 acres. The most important thing inside here, the most recognizable inside the park, is the Ferris wheel, the huge Ferris wheel, but there's also an open air theater that houses 10,000 people, and also a pond where you can kind of take a small boat out on. I then went to St. Nicholas of the Weavers, which is a church. This is one of the few churches that actually stayed open during communist rule. It was first built in 1679 and designed to look like a festive cloth. The colors include gold, white, green, and orange. I then returned to the Gorky Park area. Across the street from Gorky Park is an art park, which is basically just a sculpture park. I then took an overnight train and got to St. Petersburg. I noticed right away that St. Petersburg isn't as wealthy as Moscow. One thing that I noticed when I first got there was that their trams, they actually changed the electricity by hand with a rope. I hadn't seen that ever before. The main thing to see in St. Petersburg is the Hermitage. This is along the Neva River. This has 3,000 items of art. If you would go through each of the 3,000 items, it would take you, for 1 minute, if you looked at all 3,000 items, or 3 million items, excuse me, for 1 minute, it would take you a whole year to get through the Hermitage. You reach the second floor galleries by way of the Jordan staircase, which is a creation of marble, granite, and gold. The staircase was once used by the imperial family in processions down to the Neva River. The museum gets its name from Catherine the Great, who used it for her private apartments, meaning them to be a place of retreat. In other words, she wanted to be a hermit where she couldn't be bothered. Between 1764 and 1775, the empress undertook, in competition with rulers whose storehouses of art greatly surpassed Russia's, to acquire some of the world's finest works of art, which she certainly did. There's 3 floors. The ground floor covers prehistoric times and has former artwork from peoples of the Greek, Roman, and Egyptian peoples. On the second floor, there's the White Dining Room, which is the area where the Bolsheviks seized power from the provincial government in 1917. There's also a wealth of Russian and European art on this floor also. Art through the 18th century included are works by Leonardo, Michelangelo, and 2 Raphaels. On the third floor is artwork of the 19th century, a little bit later. So this is Impressionist and Post-Impressionist. Included is Monet, Van Gogh, and Picasso. After a day at the Hermitage, I went to Pushkin. This is where Catherine's Palace is. This is really almost a suburb of St. Petersburg. 1710, Peter gave to Catherine a summer residence. It's Catherine's Palace. The turquoise white and golden facade reaches 978 feet and has been restored ever since World War II when it was heavily damaged. I also enjoyed the parks outside. The parks are really laid out very nicely. And inside, the most impressive things to see are the picture gallery and the Great Hall. Returning to St. Petersburg, I visited St. Isaac's Cathedral, which is the 3rd largest domed cathedral. In 1818, it was built after a victory over Napoleon. It has 220 pounds of gold and can hold 14,000 people. Then next to the Hermitage, I visited December Square. This was originally called December Square, it was originally called Senate Square, renamed December Square by the communists, and now renamed Senate Square, but everyone still calls it December Square. This was named after a group called the Decembrists, who objected to the change of power from Alexander I to Nicholas I. They were beaten back and sent to Siberia, but later on the communists enjoyed their revolutionary fever and renamed the square after the Decembrists. On the edge of the December Square is the Admiralty, which was originally a shipyard of Peter the Great's, then a fortress, and then in 1806 it became a more elaborate Admiralty. Unfortunately, I got food poisoning that night. In Russia, they serve their liquids all at about the same temperature, which is lukewarm. So whether you want tea, warm or hot, or else you want cold milk, you'll get it lukewarm. So I think the milk might have got to me, or else something I ate. But I got very sick. I actually passed out. and I asked the woman at the hostel that I had food poisoning if she had anything for me to take. She didn't really understand English, so I had to draw 4 stick figures. The first, me with a smiley face. The second, me eating. The third, me getting sick. And the fourth, with a frown. And she said, oh, food poisoning. So basically the only words of English she knew was food poisoning. So it happens a lot, I think, in Russia. And she gave me a black pill, which was fairly ominous looking, but I took it, and eventually I did get healthy, but it did take a couple days, and it knocked me out for a couple days, really. But I returned to Moscow and visited Moscow's 5th Avenue. This has a lot of really nice department shops that you can visit. I also visited Pushkin Square, and also the place where the first McDonald's was, the first McDonald's in Moscow. It's a bit of a milestone. I also visited the English Club. This was interesting. It was a kind of a modern history of Russian, and it was really dominated. Stalin put a lot of work in it, and you could still tell it deals a lot with Stalin in World War II, and it gives probably a more conciliatory look at Stalin than other museums that I saw. I then took a trip to Zagorsk, which is about an hour and a half train ride from Moscow. This is a place where if you're Eastern Orthodox, you might take a pilgrimage to. It's an old Eastern Orthodox monastery. And it was interesting to look at the Assumption Cathedral, which kind of looks similar to what I saw in the Kremlin. Is actually based on that design. It was built in 1554 through 1585 by Tsar Nicholas, reportedly to atone for the killing of his own son. There's also a chapel at the well, a couple other cathedrals. The chapel at the well is where you can fetch water from. I also looked at St. Basil's after returning to Moscow. St. Basil's is part of the Red Square area. It was first commissioned by Ivan the Terrible in 1552. The central chapel, which rises 107 feet, is surrounded by 8 other chapels linked by an elevated gallery. Each chapel is topped by an onion dome carved with its own distinct pattern and dedicated to a saint on whose day the Russian army won battles. The cathedral was built between 1555 and 1560 on the site of an earlier Trinity College where the Holy Fool of Vasily, or Basil, had been buried in 1552. Basil was an adversary of the Tsar, publicly reprimanding Ivan the Terrible, but he was protected by his status of the Holy Fool. After the Bolshevik Revolution, the cathedral was closed and in 1929 turned into a museum dedicated to the Russian conquest. The museum is still open. Compared to the exterior, the interior is fairly unimpressive. The brick walls are decorated with a flower design. I then went to, there's 2 arbats, or pedestrian malls, walking malls, and there's one specifically for tourists. And I went and did some souvenir shopping and people watching at this walking mall. They sell such things as babushkas. One of the most popular things is the old communist medals or coins or gas masks or drinking flasks. You can also get your character done, and you can also get Fabergé eggs in the more expensive stores around that area. I also liked an area just outside the Kremlin. It's kind of a nice area. You could take a dip in the waters, in the pools here. It was actually very hot in Moscow. Every day it was over 90. And one thing that I noticed was all the people in uniform. There seems to be still a lot of bureaucracy here. Seemingly everyone had a uniform. I think green was military, blue was police, orange was pool inspector. It seemed like everybody had some kind of title or some kind of uniform. My next trip was into Tallinn, which is in Estonia. This was a short day trip. I actually returned to London and went up into Scandinavia and got to Estonia through Finland. Tallinn has the most intact medieval wall in Europe, or at least one of the most intact. There's 29 watchtowers, and you can tell that they're watchtowers by the pointed red tops on top of the towers. The tall Hermitage Church is probably one of the most important ones. It's the tallest tower of the wall, but it's important historically too. They had kept an Estonian flag in the bottom of the tower for about 50 years. And in 1987, they raised it, took down the former USSR flag, and raised the white, blue, and black of Estonia. This is one of the first acts of defiance versus the old USSR regime. In 1988, 400,000 people sang in front of the tower. Now this is impressive because that's 1/3 of the population. And in 1989, there was a kind of a hand-holding ceremony that reached all the way from Tallinn to Lithuania, all the way across the Baltic states. So this is very important. I took a view of the sea where you can see such things as the Old Town and St. Olaus and the Church of the Holy Ghost, as well as the City Hall. I then made it down Peak Street, which is the traditional way to get to the Old Town. It's one of the more important streets, past the Gate Tower and past the Church of the Holy Ghost to some merchant stores. These are Germanic in nature, and this merchant store has been renovated and now is the only 5-star hotel in Estonia. I also looked at the Church of the Holy Ghost inside and out. The outside is kind of neat because it has a medieval clock dating from 1633. I then made it down to the Old Town Square, which is the old marketplace. And then after it was a marketplace, it's also an area where bad people went to be shackled, public humiliation. The most important part of the old town hall square is the City Hall, which is from the 15th century. I then left, and it's also a place now where a lot of restaurants are. It's just a meeting place now. It's a nice area to be. There's also the wheel well, which is immediately off of the square, which has made fetching water a lot more popular, easier. And there's also a series of a lot of 15th and 16th century houses in this area. And luckily, a lot of these are getting work done to them now. They're getting refurbished after kind of the communist disaster. Estonia's rebuilding. I then went to St. Nicholas Church. It was an old church. It seemed a German merchants 500 years ago, but unfortunately it was heavily bombed in 1944 by the Russians. The area around it has a lot of ruins yet. So I went exploring some of these ruins, going through the gate right out Nicholas Church that has the original oak doors, and then into the Danish King's Garden. This is actually more important for the Danes than it is for the Estonians. The Danes were losing a battle here, supposedly, through legend, and basically a white cross from the heavens was supposed to descend and fell into a pool of blood. And this is how the flag of Denmark was supposedly created. If you know anything about the Danish flag, it's got a red background and then a white cross. So that's supposedly how the flag was created. I then kind of started walking around kind of aimlessly through the streets of Estonia, looking at some of the old buildings. I actually found an old McDonald's, which kind of looked funny compared to the old castles and medieval wall. I did find skyscrapers. I did find some of the new, and I also saw some of the old. I did see some fairly poor areas, including such things as women using a broom that's basically made out of twigs, kind of the old way of doing it. So, finishing off with Russia and Estonia, my impressions, I didn't really know what to expect totally from Russia. I thought it might be really poor. I heard the stories about lines for bread and things like that. And I guess relatively poor compared to Western Europe, but I mean, it wasn't really a problem getting food or anything like that, or good accommodations. I didn't know about the bureaucracy either. I did say there's a lot of people in uniforms, and even getting a visa was difficult. Some things run very well, like the subway, like I said before, but some not so well. There's not really a big, I remember at the hostel, there's not, the maid kept on asking me basically when am I going to leave. There's not a lot of, some service isn't as good as others. The people were something I really liked the people. Like I said, they're very stoic, but they're nice and friendly. It's just that the language barrier is so huge. Some of the younger ones do have a year of English, so they know some English at least. And another thing, kind of an old stereotype, I guess, the Russian women, East German women never really had a very good, there's kind of a negative stereotype, especially in the 1980s about these women, and I found that to be totally wrong. The women there were very attractive, probably the most attractive women I saw in the world. And also one of the things I was concerned about or wondering about is how much progress they made over the last 10 years. And it's kind of hard for me to judge because this is the first time I was in Moscow. But it seems like they're making progress, but it seems to be very slow. So I hope things continue to move forward for Russia, because I did see some of the old people supporting the old ways. I did see some old communist flags there, and hopefully they don't revert back to that. Hopefully things continue to go well. As far as Estonia seems to be quite a bit further along. I think one reason is because they're smaller. Russia is just so huge of an area and so much bureaucracy, where Estonia is a little bit smaller, and they probably can get things changed a little bit quicker. And they are trying to get into the EU, the European Union, which they appear well on their way. And it seems like economically they're moving ahead quite quickly. And they're trying to be associated kind of more with as a Scandinavian country than as a former USSR country. And that will be part 3 of our series, Scandinavia.
La